Today we're going to do two things. Talk briefly about the final exam, review what I posted under week 11. And then I will introduce the story and the style, some of the themes for today's film, Le Mans, produced by Steve McQueen, who's also playing the part of the protagonist, Michael Delaney. And we'll watch the beginning, the first sequences of the film. Before we do that, I also prepared, as I do with the films I introduce in any class, I'll go through some of the frames so that you can still, from the frames, you can have a better idea of the style of this film. Okay, so again, these are just notes that you find under week 11, and they tell you that the final exam will offer 5 questions, and you have to answer any 4 of those questions. So there is one that you can drop. There are 2 categories, so to speak, for the questions. Some of the questions, the majority, will be based on the readings. And of course, I'll provide a short list, although wouldn't be so different from what we've done. I might drop 1 of the readings, 2 at the most. So, as you can see here, 3 or 4 of those 5 questions will be based on the readings done during the semester. With all probability, the actual number will be 3. And 1 or 2 questions will be based on the films. With all probability, 2 of the 5 questions will be based on the films. It's up to you. You can respond to any combination of questions, right? So if you want to have 3 questions answered in your exam about the readings and only 1 about the film, you can do that. If you want to answer both questions about the films, you can also do that, etc. Depending on the actual format, when I write down the exam, what I've done in the past is also include 1 or 2 brief scenes from the film to show in class in connection with those questions. And something that I do every time is to prepare, once I've written the questions about the readings, I also prepare a packet that might be 8 or 10 pages long with some excerpts that would be relevant in answering the questions. It doesn't mean that you can avoid studying for the exam. Rather, the purpose of the packet is give you a chance to include short quotes that would be meaningful, refer to the actual style of the text, talk in detail about an example that you find in the packet, okay? So that the effort you put into the final exam during your review is not simply based on memorization of details, okay? The tips are quite obvious, right? So be specific in your commentary, in your analysis, in the remarks that you include in the discussion of each essay question. The most common generic way to try and respond, do the essay, would be to introduce some comparisons with the present. But of course, we know that we interact with cars in many ways that are so glaringly different from the past that is like apple and oranges. There is no real sense in doing something like that. Nothing gained from that. Try to discuss specific passages, episodes, themes in any of the readings or the films mentioned in the question. Since you have a packet, you might find quotes to include. It's important to discuss, rather than the general themes of a reading, let's say the motor car divorce, if you want a good grade, you should include references to specific episodes or specific situations faced by the character. So try to prepare accordingly when you review the readings to prepare for the final exam. Try to think when you quickly go through the various pages, passages, try to think, is this a significant example or twist or situation in this novel, in this play, in this short story that can encapsulate the spirit of the representation of the automobile, and then try to have notes to review where you include references to select passages, right? Try not to get lost in the amount of details, because of course the readings include pages that are transitional, that are needed to understand the whole, but once you have that comprehensive understanding, before the final exam, it would be nice for you to be able to focus on just a few passages or examples so that you can then include specific descriptions and comments in your essay questions for the exam, and try to articulate your ideas. What it means is that even if you have several examples that you can discuss, try not to structure your response, your short essay, like a series of bullet points. This is an example, this is a situation, this is a reference to the character, this is, and you describe it, summarize it, and then you offer comment, and then you move to the next one. When you're including more than one example, try to discuss in the transition from one section to another or in any other place, try to discuss how the overall theme articulates from one example to the next. If the focus of the essay question is to what degree is Molly Randolph a new and modern woman, and you have 1, 2, 3 examples, if you have several examples, then how does the character change from one example to another? Do we see elements of growth in her own new identity? Or, as I've mentioned several times, in reference especially to Molly Randolph, what would be the evidence of the contrary? What would be a good counterexample where she's still behaving according to more traditional practices, norms, ideas, so that by leveraging the inclusion of that example, you can then show the transformation of the character, okay? I've included an actual question from the 2020 exams. And as you can see, this is the style of the questions that I write. That is to say, the question will include an introduction, to mention the names of the characters, the source that you should be focusing on, to refresh your memories about some key points. And then the second part of the questions offers you suggestions, ideas. You find a series of questions here, but keep in mind that it says some of the following points. It doesn't mean that you have to try and respond and provide examples about every one of them. Again, these are prompts because I want you to succeed. I want you to write about something that is relevant. And if you have something else in mind, of course, you can include it in reference to the theme that is introduced in the first part of the question, but ask yourself, is it really a strong point? Or would I be better off picking one or more of these prompts? Let's read it together In Alice Williamson's The Lightning Conductor, 1902, Molly, the daughter of an American millionaire, is touring Europe with her Aunt Mary and falls in love with Jack, a man she believes to be a lowly chauffeur. Okay? So I'm giving you some information so that you remember the basic points. Because the main point in this exam is not to test your recollection, but rather your ability to interpret the texts, to discuss the themes within the framework of the class. Again, not by offering some generic personal reflection, but rather applying key concepts from the class. And it continues like this. Discuss the representation of their evolving relationship. So these are the key words, right? You have to focus whether or not you follow the prompts or go on your own, but the main theme here is the relationship with these characters and how it changes through the novel. Evolving relationship, key point. And how that relationship is influenced by their shared experience of the new technology of the automobile. And that goes without saying, right? We don't want to talk about love. We want to talk about motor romance. Include references to relevant episodes in order to articulate some of the following points. So it's telling you, discuss these points, but include actual examples. And again, these are suggestions. How does Jack's technical competency and his ability to handle a car make him naturally superior to his presumed social status, right? I'm referring to the idea that she's American wealth aristocracy. And as long as she believes that he's just a chauffeur, a paid driver, he belongs to the lower classes or lower middle classes. However, and she feels that there is a social barrier. She feels ashamed of any feeling or emotion that she experiences when she is in his company, yet she feels that he can be a leader, that he has some clear leadership skills or signs that his natural qualities are beyond his standing in society. Once you recognize this idea, then you can bring other points, both from the novel and from the overall discussions in the class, how I explained the concept of natural aristocracy as a derivation from a popular or a simplification deriving from Charles Darwin's The Origin of the Species, meaning that in any situation, a social context can be seen like a natural ecosystem if you have skills provided by nature that are in demand, if you are naturally endowed with the skills, the talents, the inclinations to work on cars, drive cars, then within that ecosystem that values the technology, you gain social mobility, right? And so this helps the romance stay alive through the novel. She's ashamed, she feels she shouldn't be falling in love with a driver, yet she finds a personal justification in the fact that, yes, socially, from the point of view of the stipend, his clothes, he's just a driver. But inside, in the way he interacts with other people, for example, when he defends her from the Belgian driver who will sabotage her car, has leadership skills that place him higher in society. So this is also part of the discussion in the book and crucial to the understanding of the book. Another prompt, another point that one might want to develop in here: what physical, emotional, and psychological effects does riding on the automobile have on Molly and Jack? And this would be a good example of what I would include in the packet. Because if this is one of the prompts, then in the packet I would make sure to include one or two passages, specific passages from the novel, where you find a description of the two of them driving the car at high speed and their experience of nature, what they're feeling, the air coming at them, their reaction, so that you can find it. Of course, if you're familiar with the readings, it'll be easier to handle the packet. And if you find that passage, then you can develop that prompt with an analysis, which might include short quotes, okay? And now the exams, ipso facto, by itself, cannot be generic, right? It'll be richer, your short essay on this, by virtue of the fact that you are able to place it in a context, but then discuss a specific episode. How is Molly, this is the last prompt, transitioning from female models and practices of the past to the new models and practices afforded and supported by the introduction of new technologies of mobility? How is she empowered by her new skills, the skills that she is learning? And what happens, because go back to the key point is the evolving relationship. What happens to this relationship? Or to the gender gap you would expect to find in a novel from 1902, where models of femininity are often very Victorian, right? Meaning emphasizing modesty as a virtue on women, submission to the rules of society, and especially to male figures of authority. The father, but then the husband as well, and the fiancé is, or the man you're falling in love is on that side of the spectrum. However, when they're in the car, there is a kind of parity between them, because both can be equally proficient with the car, or she can display courage, right? Because Aunt Mary, who's a more clearly an older and more traditional woman, is nervous, more emotional, afraid, concerned about this trip with the car. And by contrast, Molly appears to be more daring, brave, not afraid of the consequences of an accident, for example, and there will be an accident, or at some point in the novel, you find that Jack, of course, who goes by the name of James as driver, and Molly will go out to dinner by themselves without a chaperone, and he is well dressed. He pretends that those are clothes that he borrowed from his master, so he can be seen even physically through his attire as someone who sits higher in society. And then, as I said before, the emotions and feelings of Molly become legitimate in a way, right? So there are many ways to develop this. I wouldn't even try to go through all the prompts, because that's too much for an essay that should be a couple of pages, 2 or 3 pages, depending on how much you write per page. So between 300 and 500 words. But within the questions, you find clear guidelines, right? And expecting this kind of questions, you can study appropriately, okay? I think this is the end of that section. Yes, it is. But of course, we can stay on this topic. If you ask questions, I can respond now. This is not the only time we'll talk about the exam. I'll go back to the exam, the oral presentation, the project at the beginning of almost every class during the month of November, so that if there are any questions from people who have began reviewing, working on the project, etc., I can provide assistance. Of course, it doesn't have to be just in the classroom. You can schedule a meeting with me via Zoom, or come to see me during my office hours. Yes, Angel.
When is the exam due?
It's on December 17th at 2 p.m. Most probably in this classroom, but you know that location is confirmed only a few weeks before the end of the semester. And if you remember, inside the class wiki, there is a section called calendar, and there too you find the deadlines for the presentation, for the final project, and the date and time of the exam. There on the calendar, I put 2:15 as the starting time, but simply because when I come in, if I find any student, I'll ask them to vacate the room, bring everything with them. I'll place the exams in the room, and if necessary, I'll space out the chairs. And then I'll let you come in, sit in front of any desk with an exam, and I'll give you specific instructions. So that's where that 15 minutes come into play. And then I'll give you 2 full hours. So you have approximately 30 minutes for each short essay question. And clearly it would be best to leave a little bit of time to review the whole exam, the language in the exam at the end, or try to plan some time at the beginning for the reviewing of the packet, right? So that you decide which questions you want to answer, which one of the 5 you want to drop, and find good examples and perhaps write a short outline of your answers, right? Other questions? Okay, we'll go back. Of course, we can talk about this more in the next few weeks. I want to introduce the film Le Mans from 1971. The passages, the notes, the bullet points you see in here are all found inside this presentation, linked under both week 11 and week 12, called Le Mans 1971 Notes and Links. The story of the film, meaning the story of the production of the film, is in itself something worthy of discussion. And you understand this is a unique film from the complicated history of its production. And it started back in 1969. The film was was shot between June and October of 1970 and came out at the end of the spring of 1971. But a little bit of what happened, of the complicated history of the production of the movie, can be gathered from this nice documentary presented also at Cannes, France, Steve McQueen, The Man and Le Mans, which was produced by one of Steve McQueen's kids, Chad McQueen, who was also an actor. He played a part in about a couple dozen films. The most famous would be Karate Kid, where he's playing the part of a bully called Dutch. I don't know if any of you has seen Karate Kid, but it was once a classic film for teenagers. And here you see Chad as a kid on the set of the film, right? And the set was the racetrack of Le Mans, because they spent several months shooting the film on the actual racetrack with his father. There are other pictures where Chad is sitting in a car, and he put together some of his personal recollections and went to find the people who were in the film that were still alive at that time. Unfortunately, a lot of film was shot, right? To prepare for the film, were really enormous amount of segments that were not included that could have been used, but a lot of it was destroyed when lost. But it's a nice documentary. You can find it online on several platforms. And among other things, Chad tells you in the documentary that this was also a pivotal moment in their family because his father and his mother were about to separate. They rented, first of all, they put a series of trailers near the racetrack. They called it the Solar Village because Steve McQueen's production company that initially paid for the film was called Solar. But later on, soon in July, the family transferred to a nice French house they rented for a few months, but his father was often absent, leaving the house even when he was not shooting, and the relationship was falling apart, so a difficult time for the whole family. And the history of the film is documented by at least 2 books, and that's unusual. You don't find books devoted just to the production of a film. In this case, you find one from 1991, a more recent one from 2017. I have both. They include nice pictures, but those pictures cannot be found online, and I haven't scanned those books yet. And as I said, the film cost about $7.5 million, which was a huge amount at that time, and the earnings in U.S. theaters was less than $6 million. So not a big success, not enough to recover the costs of the film. However, the film was a long duration success. It was shown in theaters because, unlike what happens now, especially in Europe during the 20th century, even films from the past would be shown in theaters. So a big success could be shown every 3 to 5 years, multiple times. And then, of course, VHS tapes, DVDs were being sold. And to show evidence of this success, you can also consider the fact that as late as 2017, a comic book came out, a graphic novel came out based on the film. This is the first page. It was called Steve McQueen in Le Mans, and it's based on the film itself. Following the shots of the film, you will see this scene in the sequence we look at today. However, they've changed various things. Of course, there is no tractor in the film, but what's interesting is that the film itself is mostly visual. If you put together the whole dialogues in the film, you only have a few pages of script. This was Steve McQueen's idea. He wanted both the film to follow the visual style of the so-called French New Wave. He was a connoisseur of French cinema. French cinema was very successful during the 1960s, even in the US, both with the critics, but also with the people going to see those films. And the main idea for this style was the French phrase, caméra stylo. The camera is the pen. That is to say, how do you tell the story with a film, through a film, not with the pen, by writing a lot of words, because that would be theater or literature. You do that by using the camera itself to tell the story and letting the viewers get a sense of the story. That's why I want to show you some of the frames. When the comic book was made, they deviated from that approach. So, for example, for the initial scene in the film, you don't find a policeman. The policeman coming here with a motorbike when the driver stops at the site of an accident he had the previous year. There is an actual conversation because they need to bring some elements of narration to the page this way. Whereas in the film, in this scene, there is no word that is exchanged at all. And these are, I've shown you this because you will recognize one of the shots in the film. It's not exactly identical, but very, very similar to that, including the lines from the Ferrari mechanics and crew, avanti, vai, vai, attenzione, non fatela cadere, which you will hear as part of the environmental audio background of the scene. How was the film prepared? Well, Steve McQueen had a passion, like other actors from the period, a passion for racing. And he would race, he would buy sports cars as a gentleman driver, right? Those races, you would see actors or wealthy people in California driving their own sports cars straight to the racetrack and then just using the same car they drove with as their vehicle in the races. In this case, so Steve McQueen had some experience, but in this case, we're talking about a 24-hour long race. So he really wanted to have a better understanding of what it means to drive for hours and hours. Of course, when you have long races of this kind, you have multiple drivers. In fact, you cannot enter a vehicle in a race such as 24-hour Le Mans with fewer than 2 drivers. So in order to understand the story of the film, the mentality of the character, in 1969, the first thing that Steve McQueen did, he had been playing with the idea of doing a film about racing since 1966, but various projects collapsed. By 1969, he knew he wanted to produce the film itself. He was rich enough. He had done a lot of big hits during the 1960s, The Great Escape, Thomas Crown, Bullet, which is a great film, you should see it. In 1969, he purchased a car designed by a GM engineer called the Boot and entered into the Baja 1000. The Baja 1000 is an off-road race that is not exactly 1,000 miles long. It depends on the track, on the actual itinerary. It might be 600, 900 miles. And he used this vehicle to race there, right? So again, a long race because for the Baja 1000, for the conditions of the dirt roads, you cannot drive. If you're driving very fast, you might be driving 100 miles per hour, but that would be risky. And this car survived and became part of the myth about Steve McQueen. Later on, it was sold at an auction for $200,000. And a film producer turned automotive entrepreneur, Glickenhaus, his company is in Connecticut. And in fact, he can be seen at, for example, Greenwich, for the Greenwich Concours d'Elegance in June. He made his own version of the Boot because he purchased Steve McQueen's car and decided that the reputation of Steve McQueen would carry the sales of this vehicle. Of course, small production, expensive vehicle. But here you see some notes and pictures from other races that Steve McQueen entered in preparation for the film. At the beginning of 1970, he purchased an expensive race car from Europe, this Porsche 1908. And then in California, he would go to this really small and poorly made and maintained. Look at the weed and the bushes coming out of the asphalt. This is a racetrack, but there is more weeding there than in your garden. So he would show up with his expensive, incredibly fast Porsche, because this car is as a chassis made of pipes. The body is plastic, plexiglass, right? So it's probably about 1,000 pounds, maybe 1,200 pounds, and therefore very, very quick. And he would be the winner because no one else had a car as fast as this. He would set a lap record, but he was familiarizing himself because he wanted to be driving the car. Didn't want a stuntman to drive the car in the film. Do you understand that? And that was part of his whole idea of an inspiration for the film. This is another race from March of that year, and you see him in first place. Now, in this case, you can appreciate that there were other serious race cars, although some of them, this one, were kind of old by that time, outdated, but other cars are fine. But these people had even less experience than Steve McQueen in some cases, or there were gentlemen drivers who were driving not so fast, not as fast as Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen was driving as fast as possible, didn't mind if it broke, destroyed the car, and the other people were cognizant of the fact that they were driving a very expensive race car. So they were having fun, but not racing to the death. And then, of course, because he was also this kind of guy, outdoorsy and always doing daring stuff, that year he also participated in this motorcycle race. And he did a big jump, didn't land correctly, broke his foot, his left foot, and with a broken foot, he went to race his Porsche at Sebring. This was a serious race, 12-hour long, but you see Porsche, this Porsche was driven by a Formula One race driver who would then be in the movie as well, Joe Seifert. Ferrari brought the official team. Mario Andretti was one of the drivers, but there were other famous drivers from the past. Arturo Merzario, who also was a Formula One driver. Giunti, who would later die in an accident. You don't see Steve McQueen in here, is in the back. But this was a serious race. And again, it was to be experience both for the script of the film, even though Steve McQueen didn't write the script, but he gave always very detailed directions, and also to prepare for the scenes where he would be driving at Le Mans and while the movie sequences were being shot, but he wanted to drive it at real speeds, which is why this film that he made later that year in 1970 is unique, because in almost every film, including the latest one, for example, Ferrari, you see the racing scenes are shot at ridiculously slow speeds because the insurance companies wouldn't cover the liability of having the male lead driving at 150, 180 miles. Nowadays, it makes it impossible to think and produce a realistic race film. But this is what Steve McQueen had in mind. And what happened at this race is incredible, because by the end of the race, with 90 minutes to go out of the 12 hours, it was already dark, the race ends at night, Steve McQueen's car was in first place with a broken foot. Actually, the PA system of the track announced to the public, Steve McQueen is leading the race. He was not in the car at that point. His second driver, Peter Revson, who was a professional driver, did most of the driving because Steve McQueen had a broken foot and had a cast, a boot on his foot. Anyway, his car, incredibly, was about to win this prestigious international race as a private car. And something happened that I want to mention because it made it into the script of the film that he shot. With 90 minutes to go, the leading Porsche retired because of issues. The Ferraris had one car retired and one car that was one lap behind. Mario Andretti was driving the retired car, and it was a Saturday. Andretti had a race the next day. He had his own private plane at the airport where the racetrack is located. And so he was about to leave the track to be earlier at the next race when he was called back by the manager of Ferrari, who said, Mario, I want you to take the car that is still in the race. During that time, a driver, and for a very long time, from the very beginning of races, you could, as a driver, swap cars, get on another car from the same team and complete the race. So Mauro Forghieri, who would then be the manager for Formula One Ferrari team and won three championships, told him, get in the car and win the race for us. And Mario Andretti was not sure, but when he heard, he then said, when I heard that the PA announcement, Steve McQueen is leading the race, I said, oh, I'm a professional driver, so I can do it. I cannot let this amateur driver / actor win the race. And he put hot lap after hot lap and passed with, I don't remember, maybe 15 minutes or so, past the lead car of Steve McQueen, stopped for refuel, got back into the lead and won the race. Nonetheless, the fact that Steve McQueen his car was second was an indication of how serious he was about preparing for this film. This is the car itself, because the same car that got second place at Sebring was then repainted and entered into the 24-hour Le Mans for June of 1970. The race is by invitation only, but of course Steve McQueen's name and reputation was such that they accepted the car. But you can see how there are cameras in here in the back. In all, there are 3 cameras mounted on the car. And this car drove for about 2,500 miles during the 24-hour race. When they stopped for gas and to change the tires, they would also replace the film. So he shot thousands of films of the race to be used in the film. In this case, he wasn't driving. He tried to be entered as a driver, but it didn't work. They told him it would be best for the car to have actual drivers. Even though the car had these long stops, by the end of the race, it was in the top 10. It was 9th in the race, but it had been invited, but could not qualify for the finish because they realized this was not a true race car. But they treated the car as a race car. You can see at some point it was raining, and in the film itself you will find rain, and you have a better idea of the boxes. You see the bumping here. This is because they had a roll of film, a big roll of film in there. They would open it, put a new roll of film, and send the car out again. So this is not exactly the beginning, but a few frames after the beginning. The purpose of this presentation, this part of my lecture, is to show you how the film tells the story visually. Because during the entire first sequence, there is not a word. What you see is a sports car, famous sports car from the period Porsche 911, being driven on the countryside of France and getting into this village, which is the village of the town of Le Mans, right? But nothing more than someone early in the morning driving a car from the countryside into the town, and then you see the car getting into the downtown area, into a piazza, and in the foreground you see a woman who's buying flowers. You don't know who she is. She doesn't say anything. You hear her conversation with the clerk at the flower shop, but nothing more than that. But you see the car in the background. So you're trying to figure out that there is a connection. And that's the idea of the French New Wave. The idea that by simply observing, you're trying to connect the dots and build a story in your mind. So you are figuring out what kind of connection there is, or if there is a connection at all, between these two characters, and then you see him stopping and looking in her direction. At this point, you know that there is a connection, but it's not clear of what nature. We continue to see her. She goes about buying flowers, so we know that she's not expecting him. She's not looking for him. She doesn't even know that she's being observed by him. So we know that there is a relationship, but this relationship is not mutual. There is no mutual focus, attention between these two. And then he drives out of town, back into the countryside. Or is it so? Because this may just look like yet another road, right? We have a sign pointing to Paris. We have the fields that we saw in the comic book as well. But then, within a few frames, you have clearer indication of the context, right? Because at this point, you see the 100-meter sign that is placed on a racetrack so that drivers know where to brake, right? The drivers will use these signs. They don't even need to know what the number on them is, because they'll be placed at regular intervals, 150, 200, 150, 100, sometimes 50, and they know where they have to stop. So you have this indication that this road is in fact the track, because the 24-hour Le Mans is run on regular roads partially. You have the sticker of the 24-hour 1970. You have the checkered flag. So you have just visual cues that this is a driver, right? That this has something to do with a race. Then he stops. And the next thing you see is not even him, just his hands. So again, it's just music and images at this point. You're simply supposed to interpret this in the following way. This is someone who uses his hand because he's a driver, right? And then you see him, but again, you don't see his face right away because he is that kind of guy. He's an introvert character, almost asocial. And he has stopped to look at the guardrail. So you know that the guardrail has some significance. You cannot gauge the significance right away. And you just see him from different angles. And this is typical of the French New Wave, where you show multiple angles of the same scene to prolong the observation and the study of details that will lead to your guessing of this situation. You can see now that he is immersed in some kind of reverie, of recollection, or some serious thinking, right? You can get it more and more from this angle. And then something typical of the camera movements of the period, to have a shot right on the eye of the character, right? Because the eyes are the doors to the soul, so we're about to go deeper into his memories, the memories that have produced this suffered, intentional attitude, right? Expression. And now we go back to the guardrail. And because of the wider shot, we can see that the colors are different here, because this is a new place of guardrail. Because it was replaced. Why was it replaced? From there, of course, closer shot to let you know that this is important. And we just go to a scene without words at night. We just hear the cars. We see the headlights of the cars. This is the previous year's Le Mans race, because in that point, that exact point of the track, there was an accident. And you just see visuals, right? You see the break-in signs, the signs indicating the distance from a turn. You see the cars, but you can see very little. You just have to guess that there are cars. You see the guardrail. Moments before, a Ferrari, right? They tell you by showing the speedometer with the Ferrari name. Seconds before, a Ferrari car hits it, and then we have a fire. From this frames with the fire, we go to lights and sounds of alarm, because there is a system throughout the circuit, the racetrack, that will announce, alert drivers and spectators of any serious accident. So we hear that there was an accident, and that the accident involved this Ferrari driver called Belgetti. Why are they showing you the name? Remember, we haven't heard any real narrative dialogue at this point, diegetic dialogue at this point, because the same name from the car that is burning can be seen in this detail on somebody's jacket. And who is wearing the jacket? The woman who was buying flowers. At this point, without telling you anything, without any dialogues, you have a story, right? The woman is buying flowers because he wants to place those flowers where her husband had an accident the previous year. What remains to be found, discovered, is the connection with the other character in the film. And of course, from her demeanor, you understand that the husband died, that it was a tragic accident. We hear the commentator of the racetrack, but it's just part of the environmental noise. And there is an ambulance. This is, of course, a confirmation that Belgetti died. This is his helmet. But from there, you go a few frames later to seeing Steve McQueen's character of Michael Delaney being taken away. So we know why he stopped there, because he as well had suffered serious injuries in that point of the track during that accident. And therefore, the connection between them is he killed her husband, or, meaning a racing accident between these two cars might have produced the death of Belgetti, or he was involved with the same accident with no responsibility, but one of the people in the accident died, Belgetti, Lisa's husband. The other survived, but he's carrying this concern, this trauma with him. So much so that before the race, he stops to look at the place of the accident. And we go back, so we know that he was thinking about that. He goes back into the car, and we have the title. Solar Production was the company of Steve McQueen, but again, he had to sell the rights to another company owned by CBS. Didn't make a penny as an actor or a producer, just had the honor of having the credits. And this is the actual racetrack, the place where the back of the pit stop area, where the crews and the drivers spend time, and then the beginning of the race. So let's watch this same scene.